For a week in early September last year, the UK was gripped by a heat wave. But while Brits were busy flocking to beaches and parks, a prisoner at Wandsworth Prison in London was allegedly planning his escape. Daniel Khalif was an ex-soldier and a suspected spy awaiting trial for terrorism offences. He already had a pretty long CV for someone just 22 years old. But on the 6th of September, he added prison escapee to the list. Khalif was working in the kitchen of the prison when sometime around 7:30 in the morning, he allegedly walked into a loading dock and tied himself underneath a food delivery truck that was being unloaded.
At 07:50 today, a male called Daniel Khalif escaped from Wandsworth Prison, where he was on remand.
Wandsworth Prison is close to the middle of London, so traffic is slow, stopping regularly. By the time the police caught up with the truck a few miles up the road, Khalif had already climbed out from underneath, leaving only the bedsheet straps he'd used to hold on.
I am urgently appealing to the public to help us find Daniel Khalif, who could be at large anywhere in the UK.
In fact, he wasn't anywhere in the UK. He left South London and went to West London, where he was found 3 days later.
This morning, he was arrested and is now back in custody.
But how was this prison break even possible? If you wrote an escape this low-tech into a movie or a TV show script, you'd be told to make it more complicated. Aren't there people with mirrors on sticks to look under trucks for exactly this thing? Well, yes. Usually. Except it turns out, on the day of Khalif's alleged escape, 39% of the staff rostered on at Wandsworth Prison had not shown up for work. Not only that, the prison was in a state of decay, well over capacity and enormously understaffed.
The Chief Inspector of Prisons said conditions in Wandsworth are so bad it should be shut down.
This kind of thing is happening across Britain. Institutions are breaking down. More and more people are relying on charities and food handouts. 1 in 5 households with children living in them are struggling to afford food. 100 years ago, London was the largest city on Earth, capital of a global empire larger than any other in the history of the world. Even as recently as 17 years ago, Britons were the richest people in any of the world's large economies. Since then, they have gone backwards, more than any other large economy. This feels broken. So, who broke it? This is the first episode in our 4-part series called Who Broke Britain? It's about the past 14 years of Conservative Party leadership, from their win back in 2010 all the way up to the general election that's happening next month.
Rishi Sunak fired the starting gun in a dull, rainy and very noisy Downing Street.
The country has gone through staggering change, which has at times been chaotic.
I am a fighter and not a quitter.
Hilarious.
Can you get me a rope?
Depressing. And often absolutely farcical. What were the big decisions that led to this, and who were the people that made them? I'm Matt Bevan, and this is If You're Listening. Today, David Cameron's money man George Osborne, the young heir to a wallpaper fortune who took a butcher's knife to the UK budget and started the country's politics on a journey to total chaos. To work out how we got here, we have to go all the way back to the start.
Thank you.
In 2010, a soft-spoken, Eton-educated man who was Queen Elizabeth II's fifth cousin was taking the Conservatives to an election.
Why is our politics broken?
Conservative leader David Cameron was poised to win.
Why is our society broken?
It was just after the 2008 global financial crisis, and the message from the Tories was simple. The GFC was the other team's fault.
Why is our economy broken?
Britain is broken. We're here to fix it. Thanks to Britain's heavy reliance on its financial services sector, they had been hit particularly hard by the crisis.
People are still in long queues waiting for jobs in the UK. their prospects aren't looking good.
The British military was involved in 2 wars in a part of the world that nobody visits much. There was a wave of strikes and the unemployment rate was rising. Pollsters said Labour Prime Minister Gordon Brown, a prickly, publicly educated Scottish boomer, was set to be replaced by upper-class English Gen Xer David Cameron.
David Cameron is presenting himself as the youthful new man of a reinvigorated Conservative Party. Safe, sensitive, middle ground.
There was something comforting about how predictable it all was. The Tories were going to return to government.
There'll always be an England, and England shall be free.
Historically, the Tories are usually in government. Have been for most of the last 300 years.
Isn't it the case, Mr. Speaker, that the Labour Party have finally worked out that they've got a loser, not a leader?
Something comforting about predictable politics.
If England means as much to you as England.
But that predictability was coming to an end. It didn't go off without a hitch. The election was a virtual tie, and Cameron only got over the line by forming a coalition with the minor party, the Liberal Democrats. He probably would have been better off running on a simple "we're not them" platform, but he pitched a funky new plan with a funky new name, a word that would come to define the decade: austerity. The man charged with delivering the austerity program was David Cameron's best mate, George Osborne. Osborne was even younger and even more upper class than David Cameron. He was 38 years old and the eldest son of a wallpaper magnate named Peter Osborne. Sorry, I should say Sir Peter Osborne, 17th Baronet of Ballintaylor and Ballylemon. Now, Ballintaylor and Ballylemon aren't even in the UK, by the way. They're in the Republic of Ireland, but it's still a title which George will inherit from his dad one day. George started working for the Conservative Party straight out of Oxford.
In fact, I think the British Conservative Party has a clearer sense of its own identity and its own principles than any other party in British politics today.
The principle he loved most is cutting the size of the government.
The first principle, and perhaps the oldest principle of conservatism, is that of limited government, small government.
He also believed in what he calls compassionate conservatism.
Conservatives have always believed we are part of a community, we are part of a society, that we owe obligations to people in that society, people who are often less fortunate than ourselves. We also believe, actually, that the best way to help them is getting them to help themselves.
Small government, getting people off benefits and into work. This is the core of his ideology. He thought that it could solve every problem, and it was the opposite of what Labour had been doing. If there's one story that symbolises how the austerity era of government went down, it would have to be this. Just after a new government takes power, the monarch always gives a traditional speech at the opening of Parliament. This speech is written by the government for the Queen to read, and I'm not sure that Cameron and Osborne quite realised the juxtaposition they were creating. A woman took a gold coach from one of her palaces, wearing a diamond-encrusted crown, sat down on a golden throne and then told everyone to brace themselves for government spending cuts.
The first priority is to reduce the deficit and restore economic growth.
As Osborne began to roll out his cuts, he found himself cornered by the Queen at a state dinner. He said on his podcast Political Currency that Her Majesty demanded that a bagpipe school be spared from the cuts.
She came up to me and she said, "You're not going to close, are you, the Highland Bagpipe School of the British Army?" I was like, "Of course not, Your Majesty."
In fact, the Army School of Bagpipe Music and Highland Drumming was set to be closed by the budget cuts. Osborne spared it.
I immediately sent a message back to the palace that she could be reassured that the pipers of the British Army would remain well trained.
It's really quite hard to think of a more British story than that.
Chancellor, Mr. Chancellor of the Exchequer.
George Osborne delivered his first budget speech the month after the British election.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, this emergency budget deals decisively with our country's record debts.
What followed was 55 minutes of cuts announcements. With the exception of the National Health Service, the aged pension and some large infrastructure projects, nothing came out unscathed. In one 90-second section of the speech, he announced 13 cuts to benefits for single parents, children, working families and expectant mothers. The bagpipe school was okay though, thank goodness.
We will focus our benefits more towards those in need, and we will end some one-off payments that the country cannot afford anymore.
If you compare UK spending at the time to its allies, like Australia, the US and its European neighbours, you can see how starkly different Cameron Osborne's response was to the GFC. In every other country, government spending shifted rapidly into top gear and then slowly eased back down, like a driver in a manual car downshifting as they come off the freeway. The Labor government had also put its foot to the floor, but then just as it was reaching top speed, Osborne shoved the gearbox into reverse. As the months went on, more and more cuts were announced.
The army is losing 40% of its tanks and artillery.
The cuts to the Army and Navy in particular will quite significantly reduce Britain's capacity to project military power.
Public service jobs would be axed, and the people who stayed would have their wages frozen. Public sector workers rallied outside 10 Downing Street.
Some of the police trying to maintain order here might well have considered jumping the fence. Many of them will lose their jobs too in the British government's new age of austerity.
Osborne said the cuts were tough but fair, except they weren't.
The Treasury's own analysis published today suggests that the measures announced today do disproportionately hit lower income groups.
Now, you might be thinking, why would the government make drastic cuts at a time when the economy was already in trouble? It sounds counterintuitive. But Cameron Osborne had what they thought was a good reason. Yeah. Let me pretend to be the ABC's esteemed business reporter Alan Kohler and explain budgets and debt for just a minute. Thanks, Matt. It's 2010 and UK government debt has reached 131% of GDP. That's big. Bigger than the sales of brand new artist Justin Bieber's debut album. Now, interest rates for government loans are currently lower than that horn from that new movie Inception. But George Osborne is worried that they will rise.
Tighter fiscal policy can enable interest rates to stay lower for longer.
The solution? Slash the government budget to bring down the debt, cut benefits to force people to work more, and watch the economy race off faster than the amazing non-disgraced cyclist Lance Armstrong. Will it work? Only time will tell. And that's finance. Okay, back to 2024, and with the benefit of hindsight, we can see if the Osborne-style austerity was good for Britain, and the answer is quite obvious that it was not. Interest rates didn't rise. In fact, 2010 was pretty much the perfect time to borrow as much money as you could. 8 years after Osborne's policies were rolled out, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty arrived in Britain. This is not a guy that you want coming to check up on your country. It's like a call from the sewage department while you're on holiday. It's not going to be good news. His name is Philip Alston. He's an international human rights lawyer who has done a wide range of jobs in the UN. Most of that work was done in extremely poor countries in Africa, Asia, and Central America. But in 2018, he toured the United Kingdom, and he wasn't impressed.
What I saw, food banks, schools, community centres, job centres, libraries, and elsewhere, is a lot of misery. A lot of people who feel that the system is failing them. A lot of people who feel that the system is really there just to punish them.
A system that's there to punish them.
People who feel that despite the fact that they are really down and need a little bit of help that they could always have counted on in yesterday's Britain, they're just not able to get.
When the government refuses to help people, they need help from others.
A lot of it has been pushed off to the community, to families, to emergency rooms, and to even governmental emergency services.
14 years after austerity was introduced to Britain, the data is in. It didn't work, and in many cases it did the opposite of what it was meant to do. Compared to similar countries, British unemployment went up, poverty went up, Government debt even went up as a proportion of GDP.
Britain is certainly capable of eliminating most, if not all, of its poverty if it wanted to. But it's clear there's a political choice that it doesn't want to.
It doesn't want to.
I think it is getting more and more scary, and particularly as we're approaching winter and people are now having to rely on their heating. There's, real desperation for a lot of people.
Pretty much every developed country in the world has spent the last 20 years dealing with the same challenges that Britain did. Globalisation, energy transition, the rise of social media. Manufacturing jobs are disappearing, housing is more expensive, the cost of living is rising and wages are not. Trust in politicians and institutions is eroding. But George Osborne's extreme, ideologically driven austerity politics accelerated this. One of the richest countries in the world became more unsafe.
Outside the Parliament, grieving families protest. A spike in knife attacks, they say, is linked to austerity cuts.
Some of this may have happened under another government, but Osborne's severe austerity policy was like fuel on the fire. And in an environment like that, in a broken society, well, things become a lot less predictable. And when things become unpredictable, governments can start to lose control of the country.
This means that the UK has voted to leave the European Union.
So the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Well, we're going to wave you goodbye.
Resume your seats. Put your flags away. You're leaving.
Can you get me a rope?
Which is, of course, where we're headed next, on our quest to find out who broke Britain.